Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the ARA San Juan, a story of the deep sea, the pride of a nation, and a silence that would eventually echo across the world. Our journey begins at the very edge of the map, in a place the locals call the end of the world. Ushuaia, Argentina, sits nestled between the snow-dusted peaks of the Marshall Mountains and the icy, dark waters of the Beagle Channel. In early November of 2017, the air here was crisp, smelling of salt spray and the ancient, frozen breath of the Antarctic glaciers. The wind, a constant companion in Tierra del Fuego, whistled through the rigging of ships in the harbor, a low, haunting moan that seemed to carry the weight of the vast, unexplored ocean beyond. In the harbor, the silhouette of the ARA San Juan was a dark, sleek bruise against the gray-blue water. A diesel-electric submarine of German design, she was more than just a vessel. She was a home to 44 souls. As the sun hung low in the southern sky, casting long, bruised shadows over the docks, the crew prepared for what everyone believed was a routine patrol. There was no sense of dread, only the familiar, rhythmic preparations of sailors who had long ago made peace with the crushing pressure of the depths. On the 8th of November, 2017, the submarine cast off its moorings. Imagine the sound of the thick, salt-crusted ropes sliding through the iron cleats, the heavy splash as they hit the water, and the low, vibrational thrum of the diesel engines coming to life. The vibration traveled from the steel floorboards through the thick soles of the sailors' boots, a steady heartbeat that signaled the beginning of their trek north toward Mar del Plata. Among the 44 crew members was Lieutenant Ileana Kroksic, the first female submarine officer in the history of Argentina. She stood as a symbol of a new era, her presence a testament to the dedication found within the tight-knit community of the submarine force. Inside the hull, the air was a unique mixture of recycled oxygen, the faint, metallic scent of lubricating oil, and the lingering aroma of strong coffee brewing in the galley. Space was a luxury they did not have. Every inch of the vessel was utilized. Pipes and conduits snaked along the low ceilings like the veins of a great metal whale, and the walls were cool to the touch, sweating slightly from the temperature difference between the warm interior and the freezing South Atlantic pressing against the outer hull. The mission was a standard one, a patrol intended to monitor illegal fishing and perform naval exercises in the vast Argentine Sea. For the first several days, the voyage was unremarkable. The submarine moved through the water with a quiet grace, occasionally surfacing to recharge its batteries using its snorkel, a long, retractable tube that allowed the engines to breathe while the boat remained mostly submerged. In the control room, the soft, amber glow of the dials and instrument panels illuminated the focused faces of the officers. The rhythmic ticking of equipment and the distant, muffled sounds of the waves crashing against the sail were the only music they knew. But as they moved further north into the San Jorge Gulf, the temperament of the ocean began to change. The South Atlantic is a fickle mistress, and by the middle of November, a fierce storm began to brew. The waves grew into towering walls of black water, topped with frothing white foam that clawed at the sky. The submarine, designed for the deep, found itself tossed like a toy in the tumultuous surf near the surface. It was during this period of chaos that the first sign of trouble appeared, whispered through the hull in the form of a minor mechanical grievance. It was the early hours of November 15th, 2017. The storm was at its peak, with waves reaching heights of 4 meters, crashing down with the weight of many tons. Through the snorkel, which was struggling to gulp air amidst the heaving seas, a small amount of salt water found its way inside. It was a common enough occurrence in heavy weather, but this time, the water bypassed the safety valves and trickled down into the ventilation system. From there, it found its way into battery tank number 3. In the darkness of the lower decks, the salt water met the electrical terminals. A hiss, a spark, and then the acrid smell of ozone and scorching insulation began to fill the cramped compartment. It was not a catastrophic explosion, but the beginning of a short circuit that triggered a small fire and a plume of smoke. The crew reacted with the practiced calm of professionals. They were trained for this. They worked in the dim, smoky light to isolate the damaged battery tank, their breath shallow in the confined space. At 7:30 in the morning, Captain Pedro Fernandez made his final radio contact with the naval base. His voice, captured in the crackling static of the long-distance transmission, was steady and devoid of panic. The captain reported that the short circuit in the forward battery bank had been contained. He explained that they had isolated the fault and were now sailing using only the aft batteries. He stated that the submarine would continue its journey toward Mar del Plata, submerged and following the planned route. "Nothing new to report regarding personnel," he had added, a phrase meant to reassure the families waiting on shore. There was no request for rescue, no frantic plea for help. To the listeners on land, it sounded like a manageable problem, a hurdle that the experienced crew would overcome as they had many times before. The radio operator at the base acknowledged the message, the final confirmation of a connection that had lasted for decades of service. After the transmission ended, the silence that followed was initially perceived as routine, a submarine returning to the depths where radio waves struggle to penetrate. But as the minutes turned into hours, and the scheduled check-ins passed without a sound, that silence began to feel different. It was no longer the quiet of a ship at work, but the heavy, suffocating silence of the unknown. 3 hours after that last message, at 10:31 in the morning, a hydroacoustic anomaly, a sound consistent with an implosion, was detected by international sensors. But on that morning, the world knew nothing of the sound. They only knew the silence of the San Juan, lost somewhere beneath the churning, freezing waves of the Atlantic. The last words of Captain Pedro Fernandez drifted into the receivers at the command center like a fading ghost, carried on the invisible currents of the airwaves before dissolving into the vastness of the South Atlantic. It was shortly after 7:19 in the morning on November 15th, 2017. At the time, the report seemed manageable, a technical hurdle, a momentary struggle with a short circuit in the forward battery bank, but nothing the 44 souls on board could not overcome. The message was clipped, professional, and anchored in the stoic tradition of the Argentine Navy. They had isolated the fault. They were continuing their journey home to Mar del Plata. But as the minutes bled into hours, the quiet that followed began to take on a heavy, physical weight. In the communications room, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock seemed to grow louder, echoing against the metallic surfaces of the radio consoles. Operators sat with silver-rimmed headsets pressed firmly against their ears, their fingers hovering over dials, searching for the familiar pulse of the ARA San Juan. They adjusted the frequencies, filtering out the crackle of atmospheric interference and the distant, lonely songs of whales, but the silence remained absolute. It was a silence that felt cold, as if the very air in the room had lost its warmth, leaving only the smell of stale coffee and the low, electrical hum of machines waiting for a signal that would not come. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the waves in shades of bruised purple and slate gray, the absence of the scheduled 10:30 communication had become a gnawing presence. Protocol in the naval world is a rigid architecture, built to withstand the unpredictability of the ocean, yet it is also a slow-moving machine. The initial response from the high command was not one of alarm, but of measured, bureaucratic patience. They spoke of temporary technical interference and the notorious difficulty of piercing the thick, salt-laden air of a South Atlantic storm. In the corridors of the naval base, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and old paper. Officers moved with a deliberate slowness, their leather shoes clicking sharply on the linoleum as they maintained the facade of routine. They clung to the hope that the submarine was simply running silent to conserve power, drifting beneath the churning surface like a great, slumbering leviathan. There was a comfort in the rules. The 36-hour window before a vessel is formally declared missing, a window that allowed for the possibility of a simple radio failure. But beneath the surface of this official calm, a quiet dread was beginning to circulate, shimmering like oil on water, as the realization took hold that the San Juan had missed its window of certainty. Outside the heavy gates of the Mar del Plata naval base, the sea was restless. The wind whipped across the docks, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of rust and the deep, briny scent of the deep ocean. This was the destination the San Juan was supposed to reach, a place of concrete piers and familiar landmarks. The base felt strangely hollow, like a theater after the final curtain has fallen. The gray hulls of other ships bobbed in the harbor, their mooring lines groaning as they strained against the tide. Inside the command center, the maps were spread out across wide wooden tables, the edges curled from years of use. Analysts traced the projected path of the submarine, their pencils tracing thin, precarious lines over the blue expanse of the San Jorge Gulf. They looked for patterns in the weather, for any sign of a vessel surfacing in the rolling 20-foot swells. The initial denial by the Naval Command was a shield against the unthinkable. They told the public and the press that this was merely a lack of communication, a phrase that felt safer than lost. It was a linguistic anchor, meant to keep the situation from drifting into the realm of tragedy. Yet every time an operator checked the clock and found it several hours past the last contact, that anchor felt less secure, dragging along a rocky, uncertain floor. As the news began to leak into the outside world, the families of the crew began to arrive, drawn to the base like iron filings to a magnet. They came wrapped in heavy coats, their breath visible in the chilly November air, carrying the quiet anxiety of those who wait for a sound they cannot yet hear. They gathered near the chain-link fences, where the blue and white of the Argentine flag snapped violently in the wind. There was a woman clutching a photograph, the edges softened by the moisture of her palms. A father staring out at the horizon, as if his sheer will could pull the black hull of the submarine from the depths. The atmosphere was a fragile tapestry of hope and dawning fear. They spoke in whispers, sharing stories of past voyages and the reliable strength of the German-built TR-1700 class boat. They looked for meaning in the smallest details, the way the light hit the water, the arrival of a high-ranking official's car, the sudden scurrying of sailors across the tarmac. But the command remained tight-lipped, offering only the sparse comfort of technical jargon. The denial was no longer just a strategy. It had become a physical barrier between the families and the truth that was slowly sinking in. The realization that the San Juan was not where it was supposed to be was no longer a suspicion. It was a cold, hard fact, as unyielding as the iron gates of the base. The transition from a communications search to a formal search and rescue operation happened not with a bang, but with a series of grim, calculated decisions. On the afternoon of November 16th, exactly 31 hours after the last contact, the Navy finally transmitted the signal that changed everything. The submarine missing protocol, known as SARSUB, was activated. It was a formal admission that the vast, empty surface of the ocean had won the first round. Ships that had been docked for maintenance were suddenly swarming with activity, their engines roaring to life with a deep, vibrating thrum that shook the very ground. The ARA Argentina, a frigate with the sharp lines of a predator, prepared to depart, its deck hands moving in a blur of synchronized motion. But even as the fleet prepared to sail, the ticking clock became the most terrifying sound of all. Experts began to whisper about the oxygen, a finite, invisible treasure that the 44 crew members were consuming with every breath. 7 days. That was the number that began to haunt the hallways. 7 days of air if they remained submerged. Each hour that had been lost to denial and bureaucratic caution was now a stolen treasure that could never be recovered. The South Atlantic, with its hidden canyons and mountain ranges of silt, waited in total darkness, while on the surface, the world was finally waking up to the magnitude of the silence. The deep ocean is rarely the silent tomb we imagine it to be. Beneath the rolling, iron-gray waves of the South Atlantic, there is a world defined by pressure and the strange, liquid geometry of sound. At a depth of approximately 1,000 meters, the temperature and the weight of the water converge to create a phenomenon known as the deep sound channel. Here, the water acts like a massive, invisible lens, trapping acoustic waves and allowing them to travel for thousands of miles without fading into the static of the abyss. This underwater corridor, cold and vast, was the only witness to what happened in the late morning of November 15, 2017. While the world above scanned the horizon for a periscope or a flare, the ocean itself was already carrying a message, a singular, violent vibration moving at 1,500 meters per second through the dark. It was an echo of something final, a secret whispered into the deep sound channel that would take days for human ears to catch and understand. Thousands of miles away from the last known coordinates of the submarine, two isolated outposts stood guard over the silence of the seas. One sits on Ascension Island, a volcanic, wind-swept peak rising sharply from the central Atlantic, where the air smells of salt and sulfur. The other is located in the Crozet Islands, a remote and frozen archipelago halfway between the tip of Africa and the ice of Antarctica. These are not manned stations in the traditional sense, but clusters of high-tech sensors tethered to the seabed, their titanium housings resisting the crushing weight of the water. They are the ears of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, designed to detect the forbidden signature of an atomic blast. The sensors are delicate, capable of hearing the low-frequency thrum of a migrating whale or the distant groan of a shifting tectonic plate. On that Wednesday morning, at exactly 13:51 Greenwich Mean Time, these sensors felt a pulse. It was not the long, rolling rumble of an earthquake, but something sharp, impulsive, and terrifyingly brief. In the sterile, quiet offices in Vienna, analysts began to look at the data blooming across their screens. The signal had traveled over 6,000 kilometers to reach Ascension Island and nearly 8,000 kilometers to reach the Crozet Islands. When the raw data was processed, it revealed a spike that the experts termed a hydrocaustic anomaly. To the untrained eye, it was just a jagged line on a graph, but to those who understand the physics of the deep, it was a portrait of a catastrophe. The sound was broadband and low frequency, carrying the unmistakable energy of an underwater explosion, or more accurately, an implosion. At a latitude of 46.12 degrees south and a longitude of 59.69 degrees west, something had caused the sea to collapse inward with such force that the resulting shockwave shook the water for hundreds of miles. The timing was chilling. It had occurred at 10:31 in the morning, local time, just a few hours after the last broken radio transmission from the 44 souls on board the San Juan. As the analysts leaned closer to the waveforms, they noticed a detail that made the air in the room feel heavy. The signal wasn't a single point of energy, but a doublet, two distinct, massive pulses separated by a mere 329 milliseconds. In the cold language of physics, this suggested two impulsive events occurring almost simultaneously, separated by only about 38 meters of space. It was the sound of a hull losing its battle with the ocean. When a submarine's pressure hull fails at great depth, the transition is instantaneous. The air inside, compressed by the weight of the water above, ignites in a flash of heat as intense as the surface of the sun. Then, in less than the blink of an eye, the ocean rushes in to fill the void. The sound we hear on the sensors is the final gasp of the structure as it is crushed into a fragment of its former self. There is no time for fear, no time for a final message. There is only the sudden, violent roar of the Atlantic claiming what was once a vessel of war. The detection of this anomaly changed everything for the search teams. The vast, amorphous area they had been scouring was suddenly anchored to a single point on a map. But this new clarity brought a different kind of darkness. For the families waiting on the docks in Mar del Plata, the technical term hydrocaustic anomaly was a cruel abstraction, a wall of scientific jargon meant to soften the blow of the word implosion. The Navy spokesman spoke of a short, violent event, non-nuclear in nature, while the mothers and wives searched the faces of the officers for a flicker of hope that the data was wrong. But the ocean rarely lies. The sensors at the bottom of the world had recorded the exact moment the San Juan ceased to be a ship and became a memory. The sound had crossed 2 oceans to tell its story, echoing through the deep sound channel until it found the only people left who could hear it. The rescue mission was now a recovery mission, though many would refuse to believe it until the cameras finally reached the bottom, 900 meters below the surface. Even as the coordinates were verified and the ships began to converge on the site of the anomaly, the sheer scale of the event remained difficult to grasp. To confirm the accuracy of the listening stations, the Argentine Navy later dropped a controlled depth charge in a nearby area, a test to see if the echoes would match. They did. The sensors at Ascension and Crozet heard the test charge perfectly, triangulating it to within 37 kilometers of its true location. The math was indisputable. The ghost of the sound from November 15th was real, and it was located only a short distance from where the submarine had last spoken. The search area was narrowed to a jagged patch of the continental slope, a place where the seabed drops away into the true abyss. Here, the water is silent again, holding the shattered remains of the hull in a cold, eternal grip, far beneath the reach of the sun, where the only thing that remains is the lingering vibration of that singular, final echo. The iron gates of the Mar del Plata naval base stood as a heavy, silent barrier against the biting winds of the South Atlantic. Outside those cold, gray bars, a different kind of storm was gathering, one made of whispered prayers, flickering candles, and the heavy, humid scent of the sea. Families began to arrive in the mid-afternoon of November 17, 2017, their faces etched with a fragile sort of hope that seemed to pale under the overcast sky. They brought with them photographs, laminated against the salt air, and rosaries that clicked softly in the stillness. The chain-link fence, once a mere boundary of military precision, was slowly transformed into a tapestry of devotion. Blue and white flags were woven through the metal diamonds, fluttering with a rhythmic, frantic snapping sound whenever the gusts picked up. People spoke in low tones, their breaths blooming in the autumn air, as they leaned against the cold brickwork, waiting for a word that refused to come. Every time a car door slammed or a heavy gate creaked open, heads turned in unison, eyes searching the gravel paths for a messenger who might carry the miracle they so desperately needed. On the morning of November 18th, a sudden ripple of electricity moved through the crowd. Word began to spread, first as a murmur and then as a desperate, rising tide, that the Defense Ministry had detected something. 7 satellite calls. They were short, ranging from 4 to 36 seconds, and they had failed to connect, but the mere mention of them felt like a hand reaching out from the abyss. Inside the base, the atmosphere was thick with a frantic, technical tension. Engineers and naval officers huddled over glowing screens, trying to trace the digital ghosts of those 7 attempts. For the families outside, those failed calls were not just data points. They were the voices of their fathers, their brothers, and the one brave woman among the 44, trying to scream through the weight of the ocean. Mothers clutched their mobile phones to their chests, imagining the silent vibration of a call that might have been. The air seemed to grow warmer for a few hours, the gray clouds momentarily forgotten as everyone shared in the collective delusion that the crew was just beneath the surface, fighting to be heard. But as the hours turned into a second day, the technical reports grew cold. The calls, it was later whispered, were likely not from the San Juan at all. The silence that followed was deeper than before, a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over the naval base as the realization took hold that the sea had not yet yielded its secrets. Life within the vigil became a blur of sensory monotony. The base chapel, a small and somber place, became a sanctuary of soft light and the smell of melting wax. Families sat in the pews for hours, the wood smooth and worn under their hands, staring at the flickering flames of the votive candles. In the mess hall, the sound of metal spoons clinking against ceramic bowls was the only rhythm in a room where conversation had died. The coffee was bitter and always lukewarm, the steam rising in thin, wispy curls that vanished into the fluorescent light. Outside, the posters on the fence were beginning to curl at the edges from the dampness. You could see the face of a young sailor, smiling in his dress whites, his eyes full of the future, while just inches away, a grandmother sat on a folding chair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the leaden sky met the darker water. The salt in the air seemed to coat everything, the skin, the clothes, the very spirit of the weight. It was a waiting room with no walls, only the endless, rolling expanse of the Atlantic, which remained indifferent to the tears shed upon its shores. Each sunset brought a terrifying darkness, as the search lights from the base cut through the mist, sweeping back and forth like restless spirits looking for a place to land. The breaking point arrived on November 23rd, a day that felt as though the very earth had shuddered. The families were gathered into a briefing room, a space of linoleum floors and harsh white walls that felt far too small for the weight of the news. The official voice was steady, perhaps too steady, as it spoke of a hydroacoustic anomaly. It was described as a short, violent, non-nuclear event, an explosion that had occurred near the last known location of the submarine on the very day it vanished. The words hit the room like a physical blow. The sounds that followed were not of anger, but of a profound, primal grief. There were screams that echoed off the metal lockers and the sound of bodies collapsing onto the hard floor. The thin veil of hope that had sustained them for over a week was torn away in a single, clinical sentence. Outside, the wind seemed to pick up, howling through the masts of the ships docked nearby, a mournful whistle that mirrored the cries within. The posters on the fence, the flags, and the candles suddenly looked like relics of a bygone era. The ocean was no longer a place of mystery. It had become a tomb of iron and shadow, holding the 44 in a grip that no prayer could loosen. By the time November 30th arrived, the terminology of the mission had fundamentally shifted. The Navy announced that the search and rescue phase was over. The word rescue, which implies the breath of life and the possibility of a return, was replaced by the word recovery. It was a quiet, bureaucratic transition that carried the finality of a closing coffin lid. The international fleet of ships and planes began to thin out, their missions fulfilled or redirected, leaving behind a smaller, more somber group to continue the grim task of scanning the seabed. At the Mar del Plata base, some families began to pack away their blankets and chairs, their movements slow and heavy, as if they were walking through deep water. They took down some of the photographs, but many stayed, pinned to the fence as a permanent reminder of the lives that had sailed away from this very harbor. The vigil did not truly end. It simply changed shape, moving from the gates of the base into the quiet corners of 44 empty homes. The sea continued its restless movement, the waves crashing against the stone breakwaters with a rhythmic, hollow thud, while the names of the missing were etched into the memory of the nation, forever tied to the cold, dark coordinates where the San Juan had found its final rest. The seasons in the South Atlantic do not change with the gentle cadence of the land. Out there, 500 kilometers from the rugged coastline of Patagonia, the ocean is a relentless, churning expanse of gray and deep indigo. By November of 2018, A full year had passed since the silence first descended. The initial frantic energy of the international search had long since dissipated, leaving behind a heavy, stagnant grief that hung over the families of the 44 like a thick morning mist that refused to burn away. They had spent 12 months suspended in a state of agonizing unknown, their lives anchored to a point on a map where the water was deep and the secrets were deeper. But then came the seabed constructor, a massive vessel of steel and sophisticated glass, cutting through the waves with a purpose that felt different from the efforts that had come before. It was a ship built for the impossible, a floating laboratory equipped with the eyes and ears of a future we are only beginning to understand. On its deck, the air was perpetually salted, the wind a constant companion that whistled through the crane cables, while below the waterline the true work was beginning. The search was no longer a matter of scanning the surface for a flare or a patch of oil. It had become a slow, methodical interrogation of the abyss. The seabed constructor carried within its belly a fleet of autonomous underwater vehicles, sleek, torpedo-shaped drones painted in a high-visibility yellow that seemed to glow against the dark deck. These robots, the Hugin AUVs, were marvels of engineering, designed to descend into the crushing weight of the bathypelagic zone, where the pressure is enough to flatten a car in a heartbeat. One by one, they were lowered into the water, disappearing into the churning wake with a quiet splash. They were untethered, moving through the darkness like spectral sharks, guided by pre-programmed coordinates and the silent pulse of their own sonar. On the ship, in the darkened control rooms lined with flickering monitors, the technicians watched the data stream back in real time. It was a digital tapestry of the seafloor, a landscape of ancient canyons, silt-covered plains, and jagged underwater ridges that had never seen the light of the sun. The silence in those rooms was absolute, broken only by the low hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic tapping of fingers on keyboards, as they waited for a shape that did not belong to nature. The date was November 16th, 2018. It was exactly 1 year and 1 day since the last transmission from the San Juan had flickered out across the radio waves. For the family members who had been invited on board the search vessel, the anniversary had been a day of profound, exhausting sorrow. They had stood on the deck, looking out at the featureless horizon, wondering if they were floating directly above the graves of their fathers, husbands, and sons. As the clock ticked past midnight, bleeding into the 17th of November, the atmosphere on the bridge shifted. A new point of interest had been identified, a jagged anomaly on the sonar that demanded a closer look. They called it Point 15A. It sat in a ravine, tucked away as if the ocean were trying to hide it, 907 meters below the surface. A remote-operated vehicle, equipped with high-definition cameras and powerful floodlights, was prepared for descent. This was no longer a drone acting on its own. It was a physical extension of human curiosity, a tethered eye diving down through the layers of the ocean, moving from the sunlit blue into the twilight of the deep. The descent took hours. As the ROV sank deeper, the water turned from a murky green to a profound, velvety black. The lights of the submersible cut through the void, illuminating clouds of marine snow, tiny flakes of organic matter that drift eternally toward the bottom. And then, at 900 meters, the seabed appeared. It was a desolate world of fine, gray silt and occasional outcrops of cold water rock. The ROV glided forward, its thrusters kicking up small plumes of dust that hung in the still water like smoke. Slowly, out of the darkness, a shape began to coalesce. It was not the rounded curve of a rock or the jagged edge of a canyon wall. It was something geometric, something forged by human hands. First, a flash of white metal appeared in the glare of the lights. Then, a section of twisted steel, its edges jagged and torn. The cameras panned slowly, revealing the unmistakable silhouette of a submarine sail, lying on its side, severed from the main body. The silence in the control room on the surface was no longer professional. It was the silence of a wake. The search was over. The wreckage was a testament to the unimaginable violence of the sea. The pressure hull, once a proud vessel of 70 meters in length, was now a distorted, singular mass of steel, crushed inward by the weight of 90 atmospheres. It lay in a ravine, its black paint scrubbed away in places to reveal the raw, rusted metal beneath. The debris field was concentrated, scattered over an area of only 80 by 100 meters, suggesting that the end had come with terrifying speed. The bow section had been sheared off, and the massive propellers were partially buried in the silt, as if the ship had tried to drive itself into the earth in its final moments. There were no signs of life, only the 67,000 images captured by the ROVs that documented every scar and every puncture in the metal. The identification was confirmed by the hull number, Sierra 42, which appeared through the gloom like a ghost. For those watching the screens, the reality of an implosion became a physical weight. The water had not just filled the submarine. It had reclaimed it, folding the thick steel as easily as parchment. As the news broke on the ship and then echoed back to the mainland, the long year of searching finally collapsed into a single, devastating fact. The San Juan was found, but she was not coming home. She rested in the cold, dark quiet of the South Atlantic, a place where time moves differently and the pressure of the water is a constant, heavy embrace. The families on board the seabed constructor held each other, their tears falling into the same salt water that now held their loved ones. They had found the location, the coordinates of the tragedy, but the how and the why still lingered in the shadows of the ravine. At 907 meters deep, the ocean floor is a place of eternal stillness. The dust kicked up by the ROV eventually settled back onto the hull, covering the names and the numbers once more. The submarine had become part of the seabed itself, a new landmark in a hidden world, surrounded by the absolute peace of the deep. The mission had reached its end, yet for the 44 souls on eternal patrol, the story had simply found its final, silent resting place. The weight of the Atlantic is a thing of terrifying, silent majesty. Down where the sunlight fails to reach, the water changes from a shimmering blue to a thick, ink-black velvet that feels as though it has a physical presence, a density that holds the secrets of the world in a cold, unyielding grip. At a depth of 907 meters, the pressure is no longer a concept of physics. It is a crushing reality. It presses against every seam, every bolt, and every plate of steel with the weight of nearly 60 atmospheres. Imagine, if you can, the weight of an entire mountain range resting upon a single point. This was the world that eventually claimed the San Juan. The water here is silent, moving in slow, ponderous currents that brush against the seabed like the breath of a sleeping giant. The silt, fine as powdered bone, rests undisturbed for centuries until something from the world above descends to meet it. In the final moments of the vessel's journey, the hull, once a proud testament to human engineering, began to surrender to this absolute force. The groaning of the metal would have been a low, rhythmic thrumming, a deep bass note vibrating through the air inside the ship as the pressure sought out the weakest points of the hull, searching for a way in with the persistence of a predator. Forensic investigators, looking back through the data provided by hydroacoustic sensors across the globe, eventually pieced together the final, violent breath of the submarine. It was an event that occupied a space of time so small it is difficult for the human mind to even register. The implosion occurred in approximately 40 milliseconds. To put that in perspective, it takes the human eye nearly 400 milliseconds to blink. Before a single nerve could fire a signal of pain to the brain, before the thought of fear could fully form, the ocean had already finished its work. The energy released in that instant was staggering, equivalent to the explosion of 12,500 pounds of high explosives. The hull did not simply leak. It collapsed inward with a kinetic force that turned the very air inside the vessel into a white-hot flash of pressure. The water rushed in at speeds exceeding 1,800 miles per hour, a wall of liquid hammers that shattered the pressure hull into a field of jagged fragments. In that one singular moment, the chaos of the mechanical failure was replaced by the absolute, heavy peace of the abyss. The debris began its long, fluttering descent to the floor of the San Jorge Gulf, scattering across 8,000 square meters of the seabed like a metallic graveyard of forgotten dreams. For an entire year, the families of the 44 crew members lived in a suspension of grief, a gray space between hope and the inevitable. They stood on the docks of Mar del Plata, looking out at the horizon where the gray-green waves met the sky, waiting for a signal that never came. The search was a monumental undertaking, involving the sophisticated technology of 18 different nations, yet the ocean is vast and its canyons are deep. It wasn't until November of 2018 that the Norwegian ship, the seabed constructor, finally found what the rest of the world had missed. Operated by the private firm Ocean Infinity, the ship deployed remote submersibles that glided through the darkness like glowing ghosts. Their powerful spotlights cut through the gloom, revealing the twisted, orange-tinted remains of the sail, the bow section, and the massive propellers resting in the silt. Seeing the images for the first time was like seeing a ghost ship materialized from the fog. The once mighty submarine was now a collection of shapes, a silhouette of its former self, surrendered to the rust and the slow-moving creatures of the deep. There was a profound, heavy sadness in the clarity of those photographs, a confirmation that the vigil was over, and the long walk of mourning had truly begun. The legacy of the 44 sailors is now carved into the black granite of a memorial that stands facing the sea. Their names, including that of Ileana Kroksic, the first female submarine officer in the history of the nation, are etched in white letters that catch the morning sun. The Argentine Navy calls it the Eternal Patrol, a poetic term for those who never return to port, those whose watch never truly ends. It is a comforting thought, perhaps, to imagine them still navigating the silent currents, guardians of the southern waters even in their rest. The investigation eventually pointed toward a tragic chain of events. A snorkel that let in salt water, a battery that short-circuited and ignited a fire, and the silent buildup of hydrogen gas that ultimately led to the fatal explosion. It was a series of small, technical failures that compounded into a catastrophe, a reminder of how fragile human life can be when we venture into environments that were never meant for us. The families still fight for answers, for accountability, and for the full truth to be revealed from the classified depths of military records. But the ship itself remains where it fell, 900 meters down, a monument of steel and sacrifice. Now the ocean has reclaimed the San Juan. The jagged edges of the hull are being softened by the slow accumulation of minerals and the quiet passage of time. The currents wash over the site with a gentle, rhythmic pulse, a lullaby for the 44 souls who rest there. The case of the ARA San Juan is more than a story of mechanical failure or a tragedy of the sea. It is a story of the weight we carry for those we love, and the way we seek light even in the deepest darkness. The Atlantic is a vast, cold mirror, reflecting the sky and hiding the mysteries that lie beneath its surface. As we leave the shores of Patagonia and move away from the echoes of the search, we carry with us the memory of their bravery. The sailors are part of the sea now, woven into the fabric of the tides and the whispering spray of the waves. Their story is a reminder that even in the face of the unimaginable pressure of the world, there is a dignity in the watch and a peace in the final surrender to the elements. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.